Alright, welcome back to part 3 of this guide. In this part, our goal is to calculate what's the probability of getting legendary items when we can only use normal quality items for input. We are also assuming that we have abundant access to legendary productivity and quality modules. The first thing I'm going to do, and people can skip ahead if they're not interested in it, is to show you the MATLAB code that I have written for these calculations. There are links down below in the description for the code and the simulation results, and people are free to use both however they see fit. If anyone wants to change the code to a more commonly used programming language, feel free to do so. Okay, let me explain how the code works. So the first thing I'm going to do is I will actually scroll down in the code a little bit and start over here. What this line here means is that we're starting with 100% normal quality ingredients, 0 uncommon, 0 rare, 0 epic, and 0 legendary. And we also start with 0 items of any quality. And then the code goes into a loop where it does its crafting step here and the recycling step here. If we go to the Factorio wiki page, here's what the code does. It starts with 100% normal quality input ingredients. Then, after one step of crafting, this is the items that I'm going to have with these percentages. And after this, the code will take this output and recycle it back to ingredients. And then the crafting step occurs again, but now the input is these numbers, but placed along this column. And then the code crafts this table again and recycles it, and it keeps doing this until it reaches some equilibrium. And the equilibrium is basically either everything is legendary or it has been destroyed by the recycler. Now, for those of you who know a bit more maths, what I've actually done is no different than what is shown here in the Factorio wiki. You have this transition matrix. You have the 5 states for the ingredients and the 5 states for the products. And then you have the transitions from one to the other. And eventually everything turns into legendary. Now, in principle, what I've done is no different. But for example, one difference is this matrix on the wiki only tries to get legendary items, whereas sometimes we might be trying to get legendary ingredients instead. So I have a bit more fine-tuned control over the matrix. But let's go back to the top and see these settings. So the first thing decides whether there's going to be any crafting or if it's going to be only recycling. Secondly, this variable decides whether the code is going to keep the ingredients at its quality level or whether it's going to use them to craft items. And similarly, this one decides whether I'm going to keep the items at its quality level or whether I'm going to recycle them. And the way they are set right now, I'm keeping all the legendary items, but everything else gets used for either crafting or recycling. This setting determines what is the bonus productivity given by the building I'm using and the research level for the item I'm crafting. For example, if I'm using an electromagnetic plant, then I need to add 0.5 to this number. The research bonus is 0 usually, but for example, if I have 6 levels in an item productivity research, then I need to add another 0.6 to this value, and for example, this would turn to 1.1. This setting is the maximum modules the crafting machine can take. For example, 4 for an assembling machine, 5 for an electromagnetic plant, and so on. And this setting we set to true if the item that we're crafting allows us to use productivity modules in the crafting machines. This extra first step variable means that before our crafting and recycle loop, we have one step of quality beforehand. For example, in this case, we had a miner with 4 quality modules, and then we started our recycling loop. This variable shows how much the quality percentage in the recyclers is reduced from speed modules, or if we just want to reduce it anyway. And of course, generally it's kept at 0. Then there is how much productivity does a productivity module give me, and how much quality does a quality module give me. The rest of the variables here are mainly for completeness. This shows what's the inherent productivity of the crafting machine, which is almost always 1, the recycler has 0.25 inherent productivity. The recycler generally doesn't get any building or research bonus productivity, but I have it just for completeness. The recycler generally will keep 4 modules, and this asks whether we can use productivity on the recycler. The main reason I have these variables is because of this variable, which has a couple of other options. And so far it has these 2 other cases, which are special cases, and I will go through them in part 4. I won't bother with them currently in part 3. Okay, so the optimization part of the code is right here. It checks for every possible combination of modules, which is what we talked about in the previous video. So if I am crafting at normal quality and I have 0 productivity modules, what am I going to get? What if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever the maximum amount of modules that we can use is. And then I have the same when I'm crafting at uncommon quality, at rare, at epic, and then again for the recycler, but again, these are only used for special cases. And of course, there's no optimization unless we are able to use productivity modules, and there is a choice to be made between productivity or quality. And if we go back to the crafting recycling loop, in order for the code to stop, it needs to check whether there haven't been any new ingredients or any new items, or, to be more precise, whether the change in those variables have been too low, which would mean that we have reached kind of a equilibrium and most of the items are either legendary or they have been destroyed by the recycler. Afterwards, the code prints the results with each combination of modules, and then it also keeps track of which combination of modules performed the best, and it prints it at the end. All right, so let's just run one example and then we'll go through it. Let's pick that we're using assembling machines. There is no bonus productivity and we have 4 module slots. We are doing the crafting. We only want a legendary item. And let's say we can use productivity. There's no extra first step and there's no reduction to the recycler's quality. So let's run this. And as you see, it ran all of the possible combinations and it tells you here how many of the modules were normal, at uncommon, at rare, and at epic, how many of them were productivity modules instead of quality modules. It prints out what percentage of the items turned to legendary eventually, and also the 1 in whatever odds. And then it gives you the optimal module choices. For example, in this case, it's half and half. Half of them need to be productivity, and half of them need to be quality. And that gives us a 1.25% chance to get legendary items. So yeah, it's a pretty simple code. Anyone who is familiar with coding should find it pretty easy to use. I didn't go into detail over this part, but this is just more or less creating the matrix that we saw in the Factorio wiki page. This one. Okay, next let's go into the part that is going to interest most people. Let us look at the actual probabilities that we get with each of our part 2 quality solutions. The only one which I will not do is this one because it's very, very complex in practice, so I don't know that I could easily truly simulate it. So the first thing we did in part 2 was this very, very simple solution when we were just crafting, nothing else. For this one, we don't even need my code. We can just go again to the Factorio wiki page. And in the case of assembly machine with 4 quality modules, we were in this case where we had roughly 1 in 4,000 chance to get legendary. Now I have my spreadsheet here, which has all of the results. And when it comes to this case, where we just have one step of quality and that's it, this is this column. And this is the case for the assembly machine. And our odds are 1 in 4,032. The next thing we did in part 2 was to add a recycler, and we would recycle anything that wasn't legendary, and we didn't have any quality modules in the recycler. Now to simulate this in the code, we can go to this variable and change it to 24.8 so that the recyclers don't have any quality And let's see how this works for an electromagnetic plant, which was 5 modules and 0.5 productivity bonus. And let's assume the recipe does not allow for any productivity. And if we run this, this is the result we get, 0.88% chance to get legendary. In my spreadsheet, this is the third column. And for example, we can see that this number is exactly the same, 0.8797. And if we look at these chances compared to these ones where we just didn't do any recycling, just from recycling, our odds have improved by an order of magnitude. That is quite insane and maybe an unexpected result. Now, of course, it's obvious that there is no point to doing this without having quality models in the recycler as well, right? This is always going to give us a superior result than without them, but just for the sake of completeness, I thought I would add this part as well. But if you remember, this case only applies to items which recycle onto their ingredients. Let's take an example where the item recycles onto itself. The first thing we can do here is just recycle with quality modules, and that's it. What if we do only recycling? To do this in the code, we go back to the code, we set the crafting to false, and we need to change this variable back to 0. And if we run it, it gives us 1 in 2727. If we go to my spreadsheet, it's this number here. Now it's interesting, if you compare this number to just purely crafting quality items, it's very comparable in terms of its chance to give us legendary. And it may be surprising when you compare it to an assembly machine. They both have 4 quality modules, but recycling, even though it loses 75% of the items at each step, has better chances to give us legendary items than just crafting once and that's it. Now, obviously, when you recycle, you're destroying everything else, where you're only keeping the legendary item, but hey, this is what the guide is for. The next thing that we can do to improve our odds is, if we go back to this example, is to add quality modules on the mining machine. To do this in the code, you go back to the code and we need to add the extra first step. Now, when you change this, you need to set up these two variables correctly. So when we have a mining machine, we don't have any extra productivity and we have 4 module slots. When I run this, it's going to give me these statistics. And if I go back to my spreadsheet, now the rest of this column gives us these results. So when I have 4 modules, which is typical of the assembling machine, but it's also true for this mining example here, then the odds improve quite a bit. We went from 1 in 2727 down to 1 in 681. It is very important to note that when the item recycles onto itself instead of its ingredients, this is the best we can do. And as we'll see later on, but even just from this column, we already can see that any item that returns its ingredient materials has much better odds than this. Moving on, the next thing that we're going to check is to go back to this example, but we're going to add quality modules to our recycler. So before we dealt with any productivity, this is kind of where we landed in our previous video. To test something like this in the code, we go back to the code and we set the crafting again to true. And there's no extra first step now. We also need to make sure that we cannot use productivity, as this is what we're checking for now. And then the only thing to change from here on is what kind of machine we're using. Let's test the cryogenic plant, for example, which uses 8 module slots. And the result is 1.8%. That's much better odds than anything else we've gotten. So if we go back to the spreadsheet, we're talking about this column now. And this is where the result would go. And already you can see, wow, compared to having no quality modules in the recycler or compared to doing items that recycle onto themselves, our odds are way, way, way better, right? And we are a couple of orders of magnitude away from where we started with, where we would just craft and hope we just get a legendary eventually. The next thing we're going to check is, what if we do the same, but instead of quality modules, we use productivity modules only? And in order to check for this in our code, we can go back to our code, and the only thing we need to change is that we can use productivity modules in the crafting machine. Now let's check, for example, for a biochamber or a foundry. So we need to set the productivity to 0.5 and the max module slots to 4. And if we run this, we see that now it is trying to do the optimization. But what we want to check is what happens if we have only productivity modules. And thankfully, this is the last result before the optimal module choices. So in this case, we get 3.5% chance to get a legendary. And we can go back to the spreadsheet, and now we are in this column. And there you go, 3.5% chance for a legendary. So we can compare this to this column, and you can see that in most cases, it does better. For an assembler, it's about, 20-30% better. For a foundry biochamber, it's way more than 33% better. For an electromagnetic plant, it's twice as good. And for a cryogenic plant, wow, this is an order of magnitude better. Now, for a chemical plant, or when we have only 3 modules, it's comparatively about the same, and it's actually worse when it comes to an electric furnace or a centrifuge. So we're already getting some hints that actually the higher the productivity is, the more value it has. And it feels like productivity's value increases exponentially, whereas quality's value is more logarithmic. It has more value at the start, and the more you get of it, the less you get compared to productivity. But anyway, in most cases, we're not going to be using furnaces or centrifuges or chemical plants. We're going to be in one of these 4 cases, assembling foundry, biochamber, electromagnetic plant, and cryogenic plant. So we already can see just using productivity improves things quite substantially over quality. Well, I built up an algorithm. Let me get the optimal modules. So in this case, well, I don't need to change anything because it has already done the optimization for a foundry or a biochamber. And this is where we see the optimal choice of modules. So this tells us that the optimal choice is 3 productivity modules when we craft normal, 3 for uncommon, 3 for rare, and 2 for epic. And that means 1 quality module at normal, 1 at uncommon, 1 at rare, and 2 at epic. And if I use this combination of modules, then my odds increase further, and the probability to get legendary goes from 3.5 when we used full productivity to 4.1. In the spreadsheet, this is, like I said, this is the column that represents this. And if we compare it to the previous results, again, we see like some further improvement to the assembly machine. Not so much for the foundry or biochamber. Basically no difference for the electromagnetic plant, and for the cryogenic plant it's exactly the same. Basically this means that the optimal solution for a cryogenic plant was to use full productivity modules, which we can verify in our code. We just do this and we run, and we see that the optimal is indeed 8 productivity modules at each level of crafting, and the result is exactly the same. Okay, so these are the final results. And look at this. In the best case scenario, we've gone up to 1 in 7. We started from something like 1 in 4,000, and we reached the point where we're talking about 1 in 80 in the worst case, and 1 in 24, 1 in 13, 1 in 7. Great. So this is quite excellent. So now, whenever we are considering different ways to get a legendary item, we can see, well, what are the chances that they give us? But then there may be a different way to get legendary iron gears. What if instead I craft legendary engine units and then I recycle them to get the iron gear wheel? Now this presents us with a second way to get something at legendary quality where it might not make sense for an engine unit, but imagine we want to get a legendary steel, and we do it by crafting legendary steel chests. So what we actually care about is the legendary ingredient. We don't care about the legendary steel chest so much. I mean, we probably want a few of them, but more so we're going to want a legendary steel plate. So what that would mean is that we would have something like this. In this case, we don't even craft any legendary steel chests directly. Some of them will be produced from these other machines, just from the quality modules in them, but the only thing we care about is to get the legendary steel over here. Now to simulate this in the code, we need to go back here and say, well, I don't care about the legendary item, so you can recycle it, but I do want the legendary ingredient, so I don't want you to use it to craft legendary items. So first, let's assume that we are in this case where we cannot use any productivity, and we're using an assembly machine, so this is the case. And if we run this, we get into this situation where 0.32% of our input turned into legendary ingredients. This is this next tab of my table, and this was the result that we got. And we can easily compare this column with this one, where we wanted the legendary item rather than the legendary ingredient. And we can very quickly see that actually the chances in this case are much, much lower. Now, the reason this should make sense is because if you think about the only way to get any legendary steel is it has to pass through the recycler. But if you want a legendary steel chest, then we would be in this situation where we wouldn't destroy them. So any of the chests that are created here, they will of course be kept. Instead of 75% of them be destroyed. Okay, cool. So this is interesting. We have a different way to get certain items at legendary when we consider them as ingredients rather than as items. And we'll see how that's going to be important in the next part. Now, the next two columns are exactly the equivalent of the previous columns. So this was when we used productivity only and we cared about maximizing the legendary item, whereas this is productivity only and we're maximizing the legendary ingredient. And this again getting the optimal modules versus this, but for legendary ingredients instead of legendary items. In part 4, we will see certain cases where it is actually preferable to craft certain items using these cases. Usually this is the case for items which recycle onto themselves, in which case the probabilities for them would be the ones on this column. But as you can see, the probabilities in these two columns are much better. Now finally, I did not actually tell you what are the optimal modules for this case where we are maximizing the legendary items, and for this case where we're maximizing the legendary ingredients. And for that we have these two tables. This is for the maximizing the legendary item, and this is for maximizing the legendary ingredients. And you can see how to read this table is, for example, for a biochamber, this means that when we want to use the optimal set of modules and we're crafting normal quality, then we want 3 productivity and 1 quality module. Same for uncommon, same for rare, but then when we go to epic, we want to use 2 productivity, 2 quality modules. And of course at legendary we always use full productivity. Now if you compare the two tables, you will see that productivity is actually valued even more so when what we care about is the legendary ingredient and not the legendary item. And this is very obvious when it comes to the epic quality, because here we always want full productivity. Now I have a little bit of an explanation here, which feel free to read it at your own time. I don't think it's super interesting to go into. But basically, if we compare the idea of using either 1 productivity module or 1 quality module, we actually end up, after the recycling, with more epic and more legendary ingredients if we use 1 productivity versus 1 quality. Finally, I want to talk about one extreme scenario, and that is the scenario where we have 300% productivity. Now let's assume in this case we care about the legendary item and not the legendary ingredient, although when you have 300% productivity, this doesn't really matter. And when we run this, the result is that we get 400% legendary items. And if you remember the end of part 2, where we talked about this, we would start with 2 normal quality iron plates, and by the end of it, with the entire productivity, we would get 4 legendary gears. Now that we have this table and these ones, when we compare two different ways to do quality, we now know which one is the more efficient one. Okay, so one final point to make is that these tables here, the only thing they provide you information with is with regards to the efficiency of the input materials. But there's a couple of other things that we want when we create blueprints. The first thing is a throughput. So we want a minimum throughput of each legendary item that we are going to craft in order to satisfy the needs that we have for that item. And the second thing is the cost of the blueprint. So the more machines we have, the higher the quality of the machines, the more modules they need, the more expensive the blueprint, and the larger of an area it takes. These three things are kind of at odds with each other. It's kind of like that little thing that you see that when you ask an engineer to do something fast, to do it cheap, you can ask him of that, but you can't ask him to do the third thing, which I forget what it is. Um, it's kind of a similar idea. To increase efficiency, there's a few things you can do. One example is to use this column of the table rather than this. So if you favor the mix of quality and productivity modules which are used here, that probably means you will also not use beacons with speed modules in your blueprint. So that will mean that you will have a larger blueprint that will increase the cost of the blueprint, and it will also decrease the throughput. The other possibility is that there may be two different ways in which you can craft a legendary item, and maybe one of the recipes has higher efficiency. Maybe you can use productivity modules in it, or maybe you can use, let's say, the cryogenic plant with it. But maybe the crafting time of that recipe is much slower than if you use some other recipe, which is a lot faster. If you want to increase throughput more, well, first you can do the exact reverse. You can choose a faster recipe, which may be less efficient, or it may require more expensive buildings. Secondly, you can use more speed modules or beacons, but that will reduce efficiency. For example, I have a couple of blueprints where I am using actually beacons with speed modules with my recyclers, when I don't think many people have done this so far. Thirdly, you can use higher quality buildings, which increase the cost of the blueprint. And fourth, you can just use more machines and more recyclers, which again increase the cost and the size of the blueprint. And lastly, to reduce the blueprint cost, well, you can obviously use lower quality buildings, which reduces throughput, or you can use beacons with speed modules on recyclers, which reduces efficiency. And to give an example of two different recipes which we can use, let's say we want to create legendary uranium-235. If we do this via nuclear fuel, then this recipe has 90 seconds crafting time and uses 1 uranium per 90 seconds. But there is another recipe, the atomic bomb, which has 50 seconds crafting time and uses 100 uranium. So that's 2 uranium per second versus 1 per 90 seconds. So clearly, if we use this recipe, then we're gonna need far less buildings to get the same throughput. And yeah, that will do it for this video. Catch you in the next one where we finally get into the blueprints, and if you're already at the end game and you're like, well, how do I get everything legendary easily? We'll go through that. See you in the next one.